Welcome back, everyone, to the Return to Virtue podcast. I'm AJ Barker. I'm here with good friend Will Nolan. We're on episode 5 today, Fortitude. That's episode 5. So our previous episodes, episode 1, we hit despair. Episode 2, we really wanted to dive in and pry apart those acts of the intellect and the will, what it means to have an immaterial soul. Then 3, we moved into humility. 4, temperance. 5, now today we're on to fortitude, courage. Will, what do you got for me? Good to see you, buddy.
Good to see you too. So courage is a big one, right? Because people talk about this idea of a crisis of masculinity and how men aren't what they used to be in the past and aren't standing up for things. And I find it so fascinating how all the different virtues link together. So we can't make a stand for things. We can't do our duty without having courage. We can't be just men unless we're also courageous men. So fortitude's a big one for people looking to understand that and develop it.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's you tee it off for people that, our working definition for fortitude, courage. Of course, like anything comes straight from Aquinas, Aristotle, but it's a firmness in mind in bearing with difficult things that are hard to be firm in. Right? It's a pretty straightforward one, but it's, do you have that resolve and the ability to act really amidst the passion of fear?
Yeah.
So if temperance moderates pleasure, which drives us toward a thing, then courage moderates fear, which pushes us away from a thing. And Thomas, Aristotle, Saints, Gregory, they always pointed out that we like our pleasures, but we're more afraid of our fears than we are drawn to our pleasures. So fortitude is, it's tough. We laid it out last week. As tough as it is to go through temperance and moderate those pleasures, but doable. Now we got fortitude, and it's intrinsically it's just harder.
Yeah. So it ranks above temperance. And you see this a lot. You might have, guys who can control their diets and hold down a marriage, and food and sex aren't ruining their lives. And yet when it comes to it, they don't show much of a spine when it comes to actually making a stand for the things that they claim to truly care about in the world. No need to name names, but you can think of celebrities who are pretty muscle bound, masculine looking guys, and yet they get paraded out kneeling to flags they shouldn't be kneeling to for aggressive political agendas that are very anti masculine. Or they might not be able to actually make a stand in their line of work for what they truly believe in. They're like hollow men, as C.S. Lewis said, because they're too afraid.
Yeah, they offer up incense to idols. And then, I think another telltale sign is, what is a person out here sort of claiming is the most difficult thing to go against? We were kind of laughing ahead of the show, throwing these around, but it's like, if someone's sort of ranking of what they think the hardest things to go against are, like, I don't know, socialism. If they still think socialism is like the hardest thing for them to go against, for them to speak out against, it's like, all right, that's a person that lacks fortitude. They're not even recognizing where the difficulty is. I mean, they recognize it, but they're trying to act as if something else is actually more tough, so they can sort of build their stock, build their reputation as being courageous amongst things that take no courage.
Right.
Another thing, when protesting police, things like that, people come out and I'm standing up against the system. It's like, no, the whole system's on your side.
Mm-hmm.
There's no courage whatsoever in doing this.
No, not at all. After I got sacked for a lecture giving a defense of patriarchy in the traditional family, some people said, oh, well done for being brave. I appreciate that. It would have been really scary thinking about what you were going to do afterwards with the family to support, etc., etc. But to be honest, I got more of a reaction like that after I interviewed E. Michael Jones from some people and hit front page for that. They were like, "You've really done it now." Like that was big. That was political suicide. You've shown that you're willing to talk to him. So thinking about those socially taboo issues to discuss, that's up there. We know what he talks about.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I gave you my ranking, and I guess let's just tee it off with that, because if we're gonna be talking about Fortitude, we gotta at least somewhat model it. I think to me, I think the ranking's pretty clear. The things that are hardest to talk about at the top is Jews, and I'll hit on briefly even just why I think that is. But Jews, and then I said race, and then I said I think I said women after
Yeah.
that, and
Yeah.
then sexual deviance, so homosexuality and transgenderism. Then I said gluttony. Actually, I think gluttony is actually one that and I mean this broader than just like obesity. I mean, if you really go hard on gluttony, on eating for pleasure, you get a lot of scorn in return. But it's down below those other things. And then lastly, sort of greed and economic things. If you're kind of critical of I'd say if you're critical of greed, especially in conservative circles, they more try and lean into it. Go free markets, just do whatever with money. So I kind of put that one last on my list.
Yeah.
But no, at the top, I think, at least in broad strokes, why is Judaism so? Why are the Jewish people so hard to talk about? Well, I actually think there's two main reasons why. The first is because as a Christian, our operating principle is evangelization, is a desire to evangelize the world, and that's everyone in it. And there grew this chorus, obviously, after World War II, where definitions of anti-Semitism started to include not seeking the conversion of Jews. But I mean, we're seeking the conversion of everyone. I just think of St. Paul in the Acts of the Apostles before King Agrippa, and he's in chains. He goes, I wish that all of you here today were as I am, except for these chains. And he's speaking of his Christianity, because King Agrippa goes, I think before a short while you'd try and make me a Christian. And St. Paul says, yes, I wish that all of you were as I am, except for these chains, right? So that's the first thing is one, we have to desire the conversion of all peoples. But now, okay, well, that includes everyone, right? So you'll get some people go, okay, but Jews, Muslims, atheists, right? We want the conversion of all of them. Yes. Okay. So why is there an added sort of stake with Judaism? Well, this is a principle that's really lost today. It's really lost today. And that is that the closer you are to a thing, the more the magnitude of effect both good and bad things are in relation to it. So let me give you another example that illustrates this. There's pedophilia in the Catholic Church with priests. The statistics are clear. There's more pedophilia in Protestant churches, and there's way more. There's like 10 times more pedophilia in public schools. So places where people are around children, in many senses, it's the most curbed out of them. However, does the Catholic Church deserve the scorn it has? Yes, but only if you viscerally understand this principle, that the Catholic Church has more glory than all of them, and it is the Church of God. So it is held to a standard, like the grace is flowing through that church. So to transgress against it is a greater degree of transgression than otherwise, actually. And so yes, it gets a target on its back, and people like to jump on all those things, but in large part for good reason, because it is what it is. It is the mystical body of Christ here on earth, the vehicle for grace in the world. So now if we zoom back, all right. Well, one of the things that's going on with Judaism is Jesus comes through the Jewish people. He comes to them, right? I say to students, they'll ask me, what if someone hasn't learned about God, or they're not raised Catholic? Like, are they going to heaven? Every single person in this life has an obligation to try and discern whether someone is God or not if they say they're God. If someone says they're God, now you can wait until after they've passed. You don't have to necessarily do it while they're living, but after they've passed away, if a person made a claim that they were God, you have a duty, and especially if they're prominent, even somewhat prominent, you have a duty to look into, are they God? You actually have a responsibility for that. And then you will be judged by the judgment that you make on that.
And on that somewhat prominent point,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
talking about a guy who, in about 2 and a bit years of public teaching, changed the future of the world more than all the greatest philosophers and thinkers put together.
Yeah. And he claimed to be God, right? So a lot of these world sages, they don't claim to be God. We've talked about that briefly in other episodes. God sort of makes it easy. We kind of have one place where we really have to look. You know, Muhammad's not claiming to be God, Buddha's not claiming to be God, Moses wasn't claiming to be God, but we have one who is. So then we have this obligation to say, okay, is this person God? And now what we're trying to weigh is there a sort of moral profundity that at least starts to stop us in our tracks and go, oh, whoa. And then is there a fear of death? How do they handle death? In his case, right, as St. Paul says, he humbled himself, becoming obedient unto death, even death on a cross. All right. Okay. So now we have to really look at it. And then we have to say that, all right, well, Christianity, the claim is that he actually was resurrected. All right. Now you can realize a person has to make a judgment. Is that God or is that not God? Right. And you will be judged for what choice you make. And this is the thing. This is what hits at, I think this is what hits at Judaism, even more than just like the Jewish people and their desire to not be criticized for. It's the closeness of these things. It's that for every Jewish person, either explicitly or tacitly, there's a rejection that one of their own who claim to be the Messiah is not the Messiah, right? So there's a rejection that goes on. And then you look at the Western world, which is, going on 1,500 years established Christianity. And you start to see why it emerges as this sort of linchpin, this sort of taboo not to talk about. I think because it's sitting there and it's saying, okay, the closest place to Christ where there is rejection, we're going to make it out of bounds to talk of that. Well, that's going to go a long way in undermining Christianity and the viability of a Christian worldview. So I think if we put these things together, it doesn't have to be about any one person. We look at those things. Okay, we have a call to evangelize the world, and then we have the Jewish people who are the closest in ancestry, in history, in spirituality, and worship, and liturgy to the person who claims to be God, and there's a rejection there. That's going to create a different dynamic, a different sort of intensity around it, right? And then from there, okay, now we go down the list and then hit on race, women, sexual deviance, and you sort of move through it. But you can see right away who just only wants to talk about number 4 on the list or number 5 on the list. Like, they're tough things to talk about. Don't get me wrong. You can definitely face persecution for them. But I think the real fortitude, and hopefully this models it too. Fortitude is encouraged and cultivated by an ability to think well about things. So if you can think well, if you can have that sort of clarity of mind, that calm, that pieces it together and goes, okay, I think this is quite clear. Now you're actually fostered in your fortitude, because it sort of takes the weight off of it having to be this like rouse it up and all or nothing, and it's more just like, okay, now I can prepare patiently, but realistically, and with a sort of sense of urgency that, okay, here's how I speak to this thing. Here's how I address, because it would not be just for me to just move around it, to just avoid it. It wouldn't be courageous.
Right.
Okay, I'm on a long little tangent there, but
no, it's so important, that point about the Jews being the chosen people, and Israel receives all that grace from God in the long preparation for Christ, and then rejects Christ. So that's so important to bear in mind. And I think practically as well, this is one of the things that EMJ touched on in terms of control of the media and finance as well. People can face very immediate and severe financial consequences for touching on that topic at the top of the list too. So it really hits them in their wallet. And that's one reason as well.
And those things sort of evidence the difficulty, right? Because we're talking about firmness of mind in the most difficult matters to be firm in, right? So that's going to touch on why that difficulty is so evident. But I think even here, I think it's worth noting the observation that through the media, through academia, through political institutions, the sort of power leveraged on Israel and Judaism and the Jewish people. The power leverage is in part very much bolstered by people who want the closest thing to Christianity, the closest rejection to Christianity, to be bolstered, to be strengthened, right? Like the one who's the atheist, who thinks that the betterment of our world comes through the rejection of God and the rejection of Christ and these things that stand in the way and sin and mortal sin and Venus, these things stand in the way to our happiness and our flourishing, and they create conflict. And the people who have that sort of, you know, 18th, 19th century Enlightenment, modern mindset toward the world, they have a vested interest to say, I'm going to prop up and make sure that if you come at this thing, you're going down. So I mean, I do think that you see that sort of nexus. And then there's other things people, people can talk about till the cows come home about in group bias selection. I mean, I've always said here, one observation I think just worth just on the surface is, like, I think that if the claim is that like God chose you just for your own sake, like if you take the New Testament out of the picture, which the New Testament is where this chosenness gets referred to the good of the whole world, right? That's the point where now all of a sudden, okay, this chosen, it's not for your own sake, but it's for something that's going to be bigger and good for all. But if you just narrow it down and you say it's only just our chosenness, I think you're hard pressed to avoid a sort of evolutionary argument that this isn't just a sort of evolutionary in-group selection tactic, sort of social tactic. Because at that point, if it is only just for you, and there's never a point where it accesses and broadens out to all people, then I think you're hard pressed to beat that sort of evolutionary argument that this thing is just a consequence of that. Now, let me bookend this here briefly just by saying that Romans, the book of Romans, it lays out quite clearly in Thomas' commentary on it that none of this stuff is outside of the scope of God's providence. Now, never does doing evil excuse, or I'm sorry, never does God's providence excuse doing evil. St. Paul just straight up laughs at that. He says, if people say if God allows evil so that good may come of it, so why don't we do evil? St. Paul doesn't even write a robust, rejection of why that is. He just says their condemnation is just. That's all he gives, is the one-liner. That if you think that you should then do evil so that good comes of it, your condemnation is just. Right? So there's a providential plan in history. The most profound one I've ever read was Thomas Aquinas mentioned. I don't know where he got it or if it's his original thought, but he said that the diaspora, the Jewish people throughout the world, are going to be providentially ordained to be there toward the end of time. For this reason alone, he said, so that in every place throughout the world there is a testimony to the Old Testament, to the historical reality of the prophets and the history of God's chosen people. He said that if they were to fall off in any meaningful way from the world, then people would in a short matter of time sort of chalk up the Old Testament to mythology. But because there's a people spread throughout the world that holds to that piece, it actually gives credence to those who look at it as Christianity. I mean, that's mind-blowing. That is a mind-blowing consideration, that God literally has again, this sort of providential plan through it. And yet, as Thomas is clear on, it's still our obligation that we should desire the conversion of every single person that we come into and the whole world.
Right. On my old Twitter account that got nuked in the end, I had a tweet that went kind of viral, and it was just pray for the conversion of the Jews.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, that's what you're supposed to do. Pray for the conversion of everyone. And that's a really controversial thing to say.
It is. And like we've said, they're the closest to Christ. So it is worth a singular prayer.
Right.
It's worth it for all the other groups who praying for the atheists. Yep. It's worth it. But again, they're the closest ones.
Right.
This historical closeness is a real dynamic.
Yeah.
It's a real thread through. And so I think at least now, if you start to see those things and can put those things in place, and don't let people gaslight. What they want to do is gaslight you away from even considering the landscape. But once you see that landscape with more clarity, a sort of calm and a clarity comes along, and then you also realize, okay, what's my obligation? My obligation is to continue preaching Christ. Is to continue preaching what's tough about Christ, what's tough about the faith, what's tough about these things. What about again, even just that concept of God and providence and His ordaining things, and the relationship between that and then the individual actions and sin. Those things are tough to pry apart, and yet we have to push forward and hope for the conversion of those people, and especially the ones where it would be hardest to convert.
Right.
Imagine people who are Protestant. In I'm thinking of some of the great converts, obviously John Henry Newman, um, Monsignor, author of Lord of the World, R.H. Benson, Robert Hughes Benson. These people, when they converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism, they faced a lot of
Huge.
push. Huge. I mean, just social persecution, political persecution, professional persecution. So I mean, they faced huge backlash. You guys, you have to imagine that a conversion from Judaism to Catholicism would be probably far more robust in the pushback that someone like that would face. So I mean, it again, or at least to that degree, at least at the height of the Anglican Church, something around that. And so we have to sit there and we have to say, hey, that's going to be really hard. That's going to be really hard for a conversion to take place, even one conversion. And so for
Mhm.
that reason, like it deserves that in that sense, that sympathy, that to try and look at Christ seriously, to try and come to Christ, to try and consider baptism, salvation, grace, healing, God's plan for your life in that context, in say a Jewish cultural context. And frankly, the more ardently Jewish, the harder it's going to be.
Right. Which is
Like, man,
why
like
in
let's
the first
call that
century, the
apart.
disciples, it's so amazing. Like
Yeah,
they would, according to the beliefs of the society that they lived in, they were damning their souls to hell by following Christ.
and they were facing the fully leveraged. We talk about political power. It was a political power that was executionary, that had the power of execution, style death.
Yeah.
And they were facing, and they took it on, and they persevered. So I mean, again, that closeness is going to be the hardest. That's why those apostles are so high up in heaven. They're not just a little ways up there. They're at the top ranks.
Right.
And so I think we should rightly keep that in mind, that this is
Yep.
going to be a hard and arduous process, and these would be people that would really be forsaking, by many accounts, the world. And how many of us are scared to even forsake professional pursuits for 2 years to get our minds and our souls right, or
Right.
3 years? I mean, and so what? And now here we're just gonna come in hard, come in blazing about Jewish this, Jewish that. It's like, you guys, hold on. I'm not saying pump the brakes because it's not a real issue or a real thing. But this is that distinction between brashness and cowardice. So they're not falling on the side of cowardice. And the virtue of fortitude is actually closer to brashness. So it's worth noting, right? So I'm not equivocating here either. But now let's bring that full wherewithal, so this can
Mm.
be far more effective. It's like, no, the real thing that you want is like, dude, belief in Christ transforms your despair, your agony, your sin, your being without hope in the world. There's nothing like it, but it has to penetrate very deeply. And as a matter of fact, like, it's to any Jewish person that were to convert, it would be to their merit, because all those obstacles would legitimately be in their way,
Right.
right? And that's where it's like, that conversion. We're not talking conversion. There's some to sort of nominal Protestant vague Christianity. We're talking all in the historic church, intellectual tradition Christianity. That will transform your life. Would that all of you were as St. Paul it was, except for his chains,
Yeah.
right?
So
But
you mentioned how Christ faced death as a sign of his divinity, perfectly modeling fortitude. You've
yeah,
also talked about the first Jewish converts to Christianity facing death, modeling fortitude as well. And strictly speaking, fortitude really applies truly to facing death, right? That's the
yeah,
hardest thing for us to overcome when it comes to fear. Aristotle defines it like this: so properly, he will be called brave who is fearless in the face of a noble death and of all emergencies that involve death. And Joseph Pieper, Catholic Thomist philosopher, people should really have a look at some of his works. There's a great one here, super short, a brief reader on the virtues of the human heart. I really recommend that if you're interested in what I'm talking about with AJ in this podcast series. He develops that and says, look, the virtue of fortitude protects a person from loving his life in such a way that he loses it.
Yeah.
Protects him
Yeah.
from loving his life in such a way that he loses it. So you need
Yep.
something that you're willing to die for in order to be able to truly live. In other words, you're not going to live on your knees. People like this with the scene in 300, the movie, when it doesn't matter what threats the Persians give. King Leonidas would rather die than become a slave. This is Sparta. Like, I'm not going to bow because he's got these principles he's willing to die for. That's what we mean by showing a spine. So the way that Christ faces death, the way the martyrs face death, that's really the model in all of this. And I want everyone to know about the story of St. Pancras. People know about St. Pancras Station in London, and there's lots of churches all over the UK called St. Pancras as well. And he was a saint that, if we go back a while in English history, was very well known. All sorts of special devotions to him were very common, but not a lot of people know his story. So he was a 14-year-old boy at the time when he was brought before the Emperor Diocletian, who was then persecuting Christians. And he was told that you need to offer up incense to the Roman gods, or like all the other Christians who've been killed, including your uncle, just a couple of days before, you too will be executed. And this 14-year-old boy who's a recent convert, and after seeing his uncle executed, had prayed to God for the strength to be able to stand firm, just looks Diocletian square in the face and says, "No, these gods are deceivers of creatures, and I won't be offering up incense to them." Emperor gets really impressed by what he's seeing in the kid, because this is the kind of spine, the strength of character that he would want to see in men serving him, in his soldiers, for example. And he's
Yep.
hoping he can find a way to keep this kid alive. And he offers him money, power, honor. He'll give him the highest posts in the political positions in the empire. He tries everything. It's a bit like with the temptation of Christ in the wilderness, where Satan
Yeah.
just says, I'll give you the world if you fall down and bow to me. And Christ just stands firm, refuses. So St. Pancras also says no. And then Emperor's disappointed, but has to give the order for him to be executed. And then the soldiers lead him out the next day, tie his hands behind his back, and they all just send their swords straight into his heart.
Mm.
And that's it. Fortitude, right? That's what it means to die a noble death, because he's got something that he loves so dearly and values so much that, just like Pieper says, it prevents him from loving his life in such a way that he loses it. Because otherwise, he would have been living a lie, offering the incense up to the gods. So that's it. Facing death and pushing fortitude to that extreme, martyrdom shows it best. It's beautiful,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, praise God. Saint Pancras, pray for us. And of course, it's like it draws to mind the Maccabees, the seven Maccabees sons, and their death one after another. I mean, again, just a great testament of fortitude. I'm thinking too of Saint Agnes in that early Roman time. I think is it Perpetua and Felicity are similar to that Saint Agnes boat, where it's no, I'm not going to. I'm not going to give in to this marriageless person or offering up incense, and we're just horrific deaths. But they testify to that, and would that I would have the courage that they have in actually facing that, because it only takes a little bit. It only takes me considering for a little bit the negative things that can come my way for that fear to begin to activate. And it's like we can say whatever we want, but man, if we're facing down the barrel of that, that gun, that is a hard one to at least have any sort of sense that beforehand, like, oh, I'm just going to handle that. Yeah, exactly. That's how I'm going to handle that. Like, You have to dispel foolishness from, if you're going to be truly courageous, you have to be able to observe what's truly difficult, what strengths are in other people. Say if there's an opponent, say if you're debating someone and there's an opponent, if you can't recognize where they're strong, where they're great, if you're just under the illusion that everything that person's doing is foolish and dumb, well, you actually, I mean, you just got no chance. You're
Mm.
you just won't even be in the arena if you can't even address why an opponent, be it charismatic things, be it tactics, be it substance of certain arguments, if you can't understand where those are, I mean, you got no chance. You have no chance at a meaningful fortitude across any time, because the reality is that um, few and far between are getting there sort of pointed in that way, where it's like, all right, die or believe in this. Like, oh, okay, well then I'd do it. It's like, it's this long drawn out process. Even Christ, they don't execute him the first miracle they see. It's this long drawn out process where you have to hang in there. I we talked, okay, like what can we do to help people grow and develop their fortitude? I want to give a little analogy here. One of the hardest things about fear, first early on, I would say in the first stage, fears happen. You have to learn how to confront and attack them. So when they come, you need to get a sort of visceral reaction that says, okay, I'm going to lean into this thing. I'm going to just, all right, I'm afraid of that, or I'm worried about, the humiliation of this or that thing. We've mentioned off screen about sloth, which is a sorrow over difficult goods. I always say sloth is closer to softness than it is to laziness. Because again, it's difficult goods. It's not wanting to do difficult goods or things that could potentially humiliate you is going to be sloth. But so in that first stage, you just sort of lean into it, and you're like, okay, something, I'm just going to do the thing that I'm afraid of doing. Okay, well, this is where I want to bring this analogy in. The second phase is having the patience to not overreact or preemptively react. Now, first, you have to build out the ability to counterattack things. But I always think about this analogy of playing chess. My chess playing uh, took a huge leap forward when I realized that oftentimes it's better for a trade to occur with someone else taking your piece first than you taking their piece first. So, you get into a position where you're looking at it, you both got the squares defended. All right, I can take them, and then they take back, and then I take back, or they can take from me, I can then take back, and now we're in again a sort of equivalence. The the sort of the first line of thought is for the person to just initiate. They're like, okay, that's hanging there. I'm just going to initiate it so that it's just off my mind. I don't have to think about it anymore. A much better chess player sits there and lets that thing hang until they want to attack it, and then they just develop their other pieces, and they just wait, and they have that sort of patience with it. I mean, I honestly think this is a great skill. It's like, say you're worried about a job potentially firing you. Say you're in a line of work, teaching. Maybe it's not even teaching. You're outside of that, but you're worried that my Catholic faith in today's modern world, the views I hold toward homosexuality, toward sexual morality, toward anything, women, uh, Judaism, that these things are going to potentially lead to my firing. Well, that sort of paranoia can can move us to act prematurely and rashly in a way that is very difficult to both identify and occur, because again, there's a tension here. You can't do nothing, but do you have that wherewithal to say, okay, I'm worried that these things, yep, these could make me persona non grata, no, non grata, and get me fired, but I'm going to trust in the Lord. I'm not going to preemptively go out and just start railing on things. I'm going to try and hold this composure. And if they come to me, if they take, okay, then I will react, and I'll understand. All right, to be without a job is scary, right? It's a real fear. But I don't need to preemptively, let's say, leave a place in order to try and make a manufacture security ahead of time. Like, let's just calm down. Let's let it come. I think that's a huge development in the life of fortitude, is first to learn to attack, and second to be able to identify that the way that fear drives a sort of paranoia, and to say, lean into it, accept it, say, okay, I know this would be scary, but if that happens, God will give me the grace in that moment to take it on, especially if I'm true to Him and I'm true to, the truth and these things that are really good.
Yeah, and you're in it
Last
for the long haul too, right? And endurance is actually the harder of the two. It's harder to endure and persevere and be patient in this way over the long haul than it is to just find that spark of aggression to attack in the moment.
yeah, yeah, it's so much harder. If not, a lot of your listeners wouldn't be familiar with my backstory. They could go watch. I did a interview podcast with Royce White, first one I did with him, where I really sort of went into detail and laid out my backstory with football, being a American football player, and my career fell off. I sort of I had an injury, but I protested against the coach. We didn't get along. Yeah, and this honestly, it happens a lot in sports. And I sort of um, took the first attack. So I left the team, wrote a letter of defense of why I'm leaving the team without the coach knowing that I'm going to leave the team, so that I can try and get in front of narrative, which to a degree worked. But in another on another level, it sort of it drove the coaching world, the football world, to really turn a stink eye at me, no, to blacklist me, to have no interest in pursuing me. And then a couple months later, I got arrested for smoking marijuana, and that sort of one-two punch of the defiance and the marijuana seems to be the thing that ended up leading to just no more opportunities for me. But one thing that I think I shared briefly with Royce, but it's just a reality, is I had a sort of perpetual fear that the coach could screw me over. Because I had been screwed over in the past. It had happened to me many times by coaches where all of a sudden it's like you're performing at a level of excellence and then it's going down, and there's these things behind the scenes where the coach has been frustrated with you and verbally expressed that to you, and then all of a sudden, like in the case of American football, you stop getting play calls, so they stop calling for plays that put you in a position to succeed. And then your stats, sort of dwindle. And then people look at you and they go, well, you're not as good anymore. Or the coach deserved to not give you those balls because you're not producing. And so I had faced these things before. And I had a marijuana habit at the time. So I had this sort of perpetual fear that that this could be outed, that the marijuana use could be outed, and that then the coach would be able to again sort of leverage the ability to kind of screw me over. And so from this place, I mean, this was a sort of constant thought of mine, as the tensions rose with this injury, and the hostility became more sort of just crystallized. It was now on the surface. I had this sort of regular daily fear that the skulls in my closet could come out, and if nothing else, the coach could leverage that against me. Even if culturally people didn't think it was that bad or things like that, which for marijuana they really kind of didn't, and even now they really don't. But it could be leveraged at that time. It could be leveraged, sort of within the world of sports, professional sports, aspiring professional athletes. And so I preemptively attacked in part because I was so afraid of the skeletons coming out, and him being able to leverage that against me to then screw me even worse. And then people just look at it and go, well, I guess he's just not that good. He didn't deserve to be there. So there's an example of how, sure, I had a lot of that first level skill of being able to confront fears. But then over time, that endurance, like we said, that hard part, that endurance, that paranoia, I was an atheist. So all it was despair under the surface. And now I had this perpetual sort of proximate fear. And it led me to take a really drastic action, because it was like, honestly, it's like almost psychologically, I needed it for uh, my own dissolution of that sort of paranoia, or at least tempering of that paranoia. So I got to get out of this situation. I got to not be in this situation, because I could get screwed here. And then what ends up happening is that marijuana habit comes out, in an arrest a month and a half later. It's like, well, this is the providence of God. Sometimes Thomas Klein says sometimes God um, has a bad thing happen to someone as a blessing for the sheer sake of helping them to grow in virtue.
Mhm.
And he says, St. Thomas actually says, so he answers the question, why does God let good things happen to bad people? And, yeah, why does he let good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? And he says, well, virtue is opposed to the superficialities of this life. And he says, so sometimes God's punishment is to allow a person to thrive superficially with money, with job, with reputation, with career. On account of their sins, it's actually a punishment because now they're going to be impeded from any realistic possibility of growing in virtue. I mean, that is mind blowing that Thomas says that. That it's like, no, actually, the one who God loves, he might chasten and take those things away. Now, I didn't know that at the time. I'm an atheist, and it was painful, and it was despairing, and it was incredibly difficult and trying time. And it didn't stop at one moment. It was 3-4 years that it sort of just perpetually was there, and it was I mean it was incredibly difficult. But that was the Lord saying, "Hey, this is actually my blessing. I'm going to pull these things away, so that you start to look at what really matters." But man, it was so hard going through. It was so painful going through, and and that's the thing there. I bring that up because it was like that paranoia was a real that was one where it got me, where it crippled. I maybe had fortitude on the first level. I didn't have it on the second level, and God exposed that,
Right.
which grace
Yeah,
for him to
that
do.
is a really good insight into how suffering can work to bring people back to the faith, because what I found when I was sacked as well is that the very difficulties, the trials and obstacles, those are the things that actually help you to improve. And the saints say this again and again. You want to actually pray to be humbled. You want to pray to experience difficulty, because then that shows you who you really are and makes you aware of your nothingness without God, which is the actual truth of the matter that the comfort and luxury can blind you to. And what's amazing is the pagans know this on a natural level as well. Like the Spartans again, they make their lives hard because they know that's what produces hard men who are strong. And throughout history, you see that luxury is what societies are enjoying before the degeneracy and the decay hits. Like Rome, when it fell, was in an economic golden age because people get distracted from what they should truly be prioritizing in life. Happens again and again with the Mongols, the Huns, the Germanic tribes. When things are tough for them, the men are virile. They got their priorities straight. And then with too much wine, women, money, they get complacent and the comfort kills them. So the comfort zone is a bad thing for masculinity. It's a
Point.
bad thing for virtue. And the virtues we're talking about here, I don't want people to forget the fact that they're fully realized and perfected only within the context of Christianity with the infused virtues. But these are actually natural virtues too. The pagans talk about them. So Pericles in his funeral oration, this isn't to do with Christianity. He's talking about the fallen soldiers who've died defending Athens. This is our manner to take the greatest risks where we have thought matters through most carefully. Among others, however, only ignorance produces bravery, while reflection causes trembling. So when you've thought things through most carefully and you know what your priorities are, then you take the risks. That's what fortitude involves. Whereas someone else might not understand the situation fully, just go in all guns blazing and appear brave, but really it's because they're ignorant and don't know the dangers. Or the second you start to think, you get the analysis paralysis. You realize the situation fully, and then you can't move ahead into it because you're too afraid.
Yeah, yeah, and you said it too. The pagans, they'll train themselves. Our professional athletes, they'll train themselves really hard, but it's in a narrow sense. It's physical difficulty.
Right.
It's the sort of 1 hour that between the lines that the game is happening. They'll train themselves in that sense. But the real difficult training in the human soul is to confront our sins. And our sins are the things that we're accountable for. We're not, again, the distinction between a sin and a mistake is whether it's voluntary or involuntary. So a voluntary fault is a sin, an involuntary fault is a mistake. And most of our world believes that the only faults we have are our mistakes. That there's no such thing as a voluntary fault, meaning, oh, I actually wanted to do what I wanted to do, and what I wanted to do was wrong.
Mm.
That's the only place where the sin lies, and it's the hardest thing for people to look at. And so it's much harder to train yourself to recognize and see your sin than it is to train yourself to endure, 5 extra sprints at the end of practice,
Oh, for
or
sure.
whatever it is, an extra hour of practicing two-a-days.
Yeah.
For whatever it is, like those are mere refractions of the real virtue of fortitude, which pertains again to death, but again, and now here, like most directly, death of the soul, which is through sin. Will you look that in the eye? Will you acknowledge it? Will you turn, hopefully, from there? First, just will you acknowledge it? Second off, then, the hope that we have, the beautiful refuge that we have, is then God offers a lifeline for what to do in that case. He sends. Saint Augustine says, only the cross, only God incarnating himself and becoming a person who suffered and died the way that he did, could so perfectly soften the pride of man. Like, it's only that, like, and so that's the thing too, right? To grow in virtue, reflect on the passion, reflect on the cross, do it regularly. Try and think, imagine different ways. Hilaire Belloc said, in order to be a historian, you have to have a great imagination, right? It's like, I always think history becomes way more interesting the second I start thinking about the simple thoughts of, like, dang, they didn't have cell phones.
Mhm.
Like, if they wanted to go somewhere, they didn't have cars and trains. Like, if they wanted to travel, like 20 miles or like 30 kilometers to go visit some, that's gonna be like a 3-day trip, and they're probably gonna stay for like a week because they got to pack up the whole house basically to make the trip.
Yeah.
And letter writing, it's like, oh man, you write a letter, you're probably not hearing back for probably a month and a half or something, and like it probably starts to explain why these letters are so sort of extensive and elegant. It's not just, hey, what's up, you know it's first I'm filling you in on what's been going on, and then I'm trying to share with you some of my thoughts, just in general, things I've been thinking about lately. And then a friendship evolves between letter writers who can really do that well, who can express thoughts, and then it's interesting, and then they can write back. So I mean, it's like, well, think about the discipline of mind that would bring. All right, this is a side tangent, because it's like, just by imagining those few things, now I start to enter into history, and it immediately becomes more fascinating. And at different times in history, or different places, you bring in different pictures. Okay, imagine, right? They don't have electricity, they don't have running water, they don't have this. They don't even have a sort of tempered, let's say, animal landscape where the right now the other predators in the animal landscape are very subdued just by the overall global effect of modern world. So if you have none of that, now these things are thriving. Lions, these things are thriving out there. And like, okay, wow. Now I'm trying to imagine what it's like being Abraham in a nomadic time when God tells him, "Thou shalt not murder," where it's like there's no police. So if you murder someone, there's no one coming to like investigate. So you're really living in a time for thousands of years where it's like, dang, you could straight up murder this person, and no one's ever coming back to like arrest you and throw you in jail. Like, okay, maybe the temptation to murder now is way strong, and maybe for God to make clear, "Thou shalt not murder," is really significant. It's not, as the atheists say, well, everyone can know that you shouldn't murder. Like, dang, but if there's no cops and you only run into a few hundred people maybe in a given lifetime, and you have a beef that goes on, or that person does something unjust, or they screw you, like, why shouldn't you vengeance kill them? You know, that's probably going to be an efficient way to handle. So this is what I mean by, like, imagination brings these things alive, and as do the same thing with the passion and the cross with Christ. Imagine being there and witnessing Christ literally perform a miracle. Think about how blown your mind would be. I always say to students, I go, imagine if Christ lived now and was doing the miracles that he did. Like, yeah, someone would have caught it on camera, and you'd see it, and you'd be like, what? It's like, so think about those things. And then think about, I always, I think I've seen this before on an earlier show, but think about, like, we can already imagine how hard it would be to be falsely imprisoned, falsely accused of a crime. Like, how scary that would be if the feds came down on you or something for just a totally false crime. It's like, okay, well, now you can step into that world where it's like, okay, Christ is totally falsely accused and he's going to be put to death. And this dude, and it's not even like martyrs who come after who are like they get to stand up for Christ. He doesn't even have Christ to stand up for where it's like sort of honorable and noble. For him, even the nobility of the death is tempered and disguised, and yet he imbues it with a nobility. That's where it's like, no, the death of Christ is infinite times more difficult, more glorious on account of that difficulty than even every single martyr after who dies in his name,
Right.
right?
And you
At that
can you
point, now
can
you're
use
dying.
this imagination as well that you're talking about to help you grow in virtue. It's a bit like what the Stoics did, where they just imagine what the worst possible outcome would be
Yeah,
as an exercise in mental training. So if you can actually present that to yourself, what you'll do is actually excite some of the passions that you would feel if it was really happening to you. And you can actually face those and start to
yeah,
train them in imagination. So if you want to grow in fortitude, yes, of course, you, as Aristotle says, because virtue is a skill, you have to actually start being braver in day to day life by holding yourself accountable to making this stand for the things that you truly care about. And you can start, for some people, by just not telling white lies to flatter people or make them feel good. That's a form of bravery. Telling the truth is a form of bravery, right? It requires fortitude to do that because what the martyrs are doing ultimately is dying for the truth, Christ, truth with the capital T. So you have to be able to prioritize truth in that way. And you start by doing it in small ways in your daily speech. That's something that we all get the opportunity for. I'm not saying, by the way, that you have to go out and give the hard truths, bro, and facts over feelings the entire time because that can be rash. You don't always need to speak your mind fully in every single circumstance. You don't lie, but you can just keep quiet sometimes. Like the chess example that AJ was talking about earlier. You can just keep quiet and wait. And then when they come for you, then you can make your move. You don't have to be the one who blurts out the thing that is automatically going to get you sacked. That's not what I'm saying. But when it
yeah,
comes to it, you speak the truth. Now, next thing though is just play out different scenarios. Like, what if
yeah.
this happened? How would you deal with it? And you can begin to train yourself in that way as well. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, in our pre-show notes, I put down a list of things for training in virtue that I think, especially a father, husband in the household, should spend time reflecting on in this sort of what you're saying is a sort of stoic method of using the imagination to prepare to elicit these emotions and then prepare for how you would respond to them. What priorities would you stick to? Um, and so I say for a husband, a father of a family, the first thing you should prepare for is the loss of a child. You should reflect regularly on the death of one of your child, an untimely death of one of your child, or a prolonged death, say a prognosis, a terminal diagnosis. Um, this will be one of the hardest things you could ever face. And if your family has to go through it, the best thing that you can do is have spent time saying, what what principles do I hold to in that in light of that? And I'll tell you what, very very briefly, it becomes very clear when you reflect on those hardest of things that Christ. All I want is Christ at the center of all things, right? And it actually informs then how you live the any interim time that there could be until something like that happens. And God willing, hopefully it doesn't happen. But if it does happen, that's why it's so important that the family has a practice of mass and of confession and of real meaningful faith and of study and of discipline and of sacrifice, because the only thing that will guide you through something like that is not just faith, but a deeply deeply practiced and lived faith and virtue,
Mm,
right? And so as I would say, like, as there's even in a special way for the husband and the father, there's a special obligation toward this, right? We talked in the second episode about the rational intellect, how it's mediated by the body. Well, the body is stronger in its emotional attachment, in its sort of visceral reality in women than it is in men, for the sheer sort of biological reason of having to give birth, of having to be pregnant for an extended period and then nurse. It draws them more into the present. So these the physical ties to the present are stronger there. And what that actually means though is that man has a sort of distance from it. And so they should take that distance. They should use that, and they should imagine the scenarios and the emotions that would come about ahead of time. Um, I would
But
imagine that for many women to contemplate on these things would cause, just an enormous crisis, and it does for men too. If you're not triggering a crisis and truly thinking about it, you're not truly thinking about it yet,
what's
right?
one reason for that is that um, just in terms of like basic anthropology, it's been shown that when a mother dies, the infant's normally going to die. An infant can
Wow.
survive the death of a father, but when the mother goes, the child's chances of survival are minuscule. And women have
Wow.
never been conscripted into frontline combat by any country, anywhere in the world, at any point in human history. They have fought in frontline combat, like the Celtic women killed some of the Roman centurions. It
Yeah.
happened. Tacitus records that, but they weren't forced to, right? So
Yeah.
this association between being a man and being willing to lay down your life for something is really deeply ingrained in men as a result of conscription and the fact that biologically we're more expendable. So masculinity and shedding blood and self-sacrifice are deeply intimately intertwined in a way that being female and sacrificing yourself are not. So
Yeah. Yeah.
if philosophy is training for death, as Plato put it, and martyrdom ultimately is about facing death with that supreme fortitude and being willing to die for the truth, then there's a calling to men in particular to be willing to do this. Why
Yeah.
does Christ choose only men to send out into the world to go and preach his gospel? An apostle literally means one sent. It's a
Right.
military metaphor. He's saying you were going out into battle, and he
Right.
knows the gruesome deaths they're going to face. He knows Peter's getting crucified upside down.
Yep. And again, he's also incorporating the Israelite tradition, where the family of the Levites, the house of Levi, is the priestly class, and it's the male heirs that are the only ones. So for him, again, he's incorporating a norm that's an established, you know, 1300-year norm
Right.
at that
And
point. So
with
when
the Crusaders
it's
too.
like he doesn't have to come out and say, "Hey, to be clear, no women are going to be ordained." When he only ordains man, he's incorporating a norm that is 1300 years in the running. So everyone knows, like, there's no question around this.
Right.
It's one of these things. It's like, again, and so yeah. To go back to it, it's like for a father, you reflect on that. That's one of the hard things for people who are looking for a partner. Reflect on your spouse cheating you, wanting to take you through an ugly divorce, all these things. What's your response? Well, this will actually help you realize what the point of marriage is. Because the point of marriage is not your happiness. Hopefully your happiness comes through it. But the point is the commitment, and is to unite yourself to another person to become the means of salvation to the other one. That's why if that person goes rogue, abdicates the faith, starts cheating on you, wants to bring you to divorce courts. By the way, those divorce courts are going to settle against you. They're going to take your money. They're going to, give the custody to. I mean, that's just what happens in some high 90% of the cases. So that stuff's going to play out. All right. Do you still understand your purpose in that marriage that you would have entered into, that you've already entered into? Right? For me, I tell my wife that, hey, I get it. If you mount that campaign, the world's going to back you. I'm not going to have any chance in that in that regard, but I will continue to pray for your soul, for your salvation. You will
Mhm.
not see me get remarried. Even if you went and got remarried, I get it. The state will give you a certificate of marriage. They'll whatever, acknowledge it. They'll give you those tax rates. I will not, and I'll be there praying for you, and you will be my wife, until the end of life. And by the way, the ability to see that and say that it punctures the heart of the one who hears it, because it's real,
It's a good reminder,
and
though,
they
right?
understand
That
it's real love.
marriage also requires fortitude, and I've often thought that another one of the symptoms of the crisis of masculinity is men's fear of marriage. People who
Yeah,
say, I just won't do it. The risks are too great. Well, if you've got a proper understanding of the fact that marriage is a divine command, the first one given to Adam and Eve out of Eden, and it's a duty that you have to God because He wants more potential saints for heaven, the natural purpose of marriage as an institution being procreation, then
Yep.
it doesn't matter if you're a bit afraid of it. This is still your vocation, and you can't squirm away from that because of your effeminacy in worrying about what some of the difficulties you might face could be. And the fact is, even if you don't wind up with a really nasty divorce like that, marriage is still tough.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard. I mean, it not only is it hard, but it's like you look around and so many people when they get divorced, they, will report that we weren't in love for 5 years. We weren't in love for 8 years. It's like they're not lying. They're telling the truth. The reason they're not in love though is because marriage is tough and they never took on the toughness of it.
Mm.
They never
The-
took on the difficulty of it. So of course their marriage was meaningless. Now,
right.
does that mean that now they're justified to go divorce from one another? No, it doesn't. But it's like, yeah, you get how it's like, okay, that mounting pressure, that's going to cripple a lot of people. That's why you can still advocate for a social policy that says, let's abandon no fault divorce, because this would be better on the whole for a society to attach fault to divorce and really to even sort of move toward an insolubility. I'd even go a step further, and I think a good secular principle would be one person, one marriage. It's like let each person, whatever tax breaks society gives, incentives, let it be for one person per person. That's it. Like I think that would be a good incentive, a sort of natural incentive within a society.
The French,
Uh,
the
yeah.
counter-revolutionary writer Louis de Bonald, who wrote one of the first anti-divorce tracts in Western literature,
Wow.
he said that the problem with divorce is that it results basically in multiple wives because you just get serial monogamy becoming polygamy. And he was saying, well, with divorce, we're basically the same as the Muslims, but we're just not as honest about it because a man can now go through life with a whole string of wives. So
Yeah.
that point you're making there about you have one marriage is
It's
important. He
totally
made
it's
the same
totally
point.
inappropriate. And even people say, well, what about when you die, you can remarry? It's like Pope John Paul II actually addressed this really well. He said in his book Love and Responsibility, he said, yes, it's licit for you to get remarried. Why? Because the principle of marriage is it's for this life. It's because it's ordained toward procreation of offspring. He says, but it should never be lost that it is praiseworthy to remain a widow. And again, this is a sort of natural, visceral instinct. We know that we honor our spouse more if we don't get remarried. Like, that's just, come on. You're lying to yourself. You're playing games. Stop playing games with yourself. If you're sitting there going, well, but the church allows, like, no, I mean, I've told my wife, even if she faced a young death, I hope, I want to never get remarried because that is my wife. And I don't care if it was 30 years I had to live, 40 years. No, I'm not going to replace you. You have a singular place in my heart and in my soul. As hard as it is, so many times in the marriage, you have a singular place.
Hmm.
And that is the way in which I love you. And I even told her, I said, I get it. The church permits it. You could, if I were to pass away early, you can get remarried. But don't think I'll be up in heaven just like happy, like, oh, I want you to be happy. No, I'd rather that you honor our marriage. I'm
Well, yeah,
telling you, like,
even though there's no marriage in
I'm,
heaven, you still have a special relationship in heaven with the
yeah, you
person
have
who
a
was your
closeness.
spouse. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
exactly.
like, don't lie to yourself and tell you like, well, oh, if other people come to you and say, well, he would have wanted it this way. Now I've told you up front, no, I don't. Like, I don't. Okay, if you do it, you do it, and I still love you, all those things. But let's not get it twisted. I would rather that you honor this marriage that we have for our whole life, even if you're 40, we got young kids, you're facing it, it's difficult. I get it. I get it. That'd be really hard. And yet, let me still tell you, not this life. Let's expand the view. It's not this life. It's not the cares of this week or this month or this year. I hope that you would. I've said that to her explicitly in this same sort of tone, this sort of playful, in this sense of like, no, I mean, I really do. Just hope you don't. And it's the same. I mean, I've said to her, I mean, as close to a vow as it not being a sort of formal, you know, observed vow by others, but a vow that I will not get remarried.
Right.
If this doesn't
Yes.
work out, and I know that would be hard, and especially if it was young, it would be really hard. But you know what? hard things can happen in this life, and it might even fail miserably. You know, our kids, they might be neglected and all this. Hey, that might happen. Let's turn to the Lord. So again,
And
it's
embrace
not to
the
come down to
hardship.
anyone who does go to that, who does turn to that. It's listed, and it's permissible, and not only that, it's like, it's okay, you can do it, but let's not reject what is the higher thing,
Right, exactly.
right? It's like there are some orders of priesthood where, in the Roman church, in the Catholic Church, where they can get married, but let's not, come on, let's stop deluding ourselves. It is far more noble to be celibate in
Mhm.
your vocation. Is
Mhm.
far more testifying to the reality of God and the worthiness of giving all for God. So it's just not even close. And it's the same thing. To remain a widow is far more beautiful. If you met an elder woman, say a grandparent or something, and she's in her 80s, and her husband died when he was in his 40s, and she remained a widow. Come on, dude, that prick your heart. That's a beautiful love story. And same thing, vice versa. If there's a guy and he never again married another woman, he didn't date other women, he didn't nothing, and he went 40 years, you go, man. Every young kid sits there, and goes, "That's the love I want. Someone who would love me in that way." Yeah,
Yeah,
you
they
know.
recognize something in that about justice and all the virtues being connected as a point that we started with. And you're saying here it's more just for things to be that way, and people can recognize that and see it.
Yeah,
And bringing it back to fortitude specifically and bravery, Aquinas says that praise for bravery is contingent upon justice. So it's about
beautiful.
suffering and facing the hardship for the sake of doing the right thing, which is why the martyrs are the strongest examples of it. But I just wanted to finish off with people wondering about, are they really showing fortitude or not with different situations in life? Quick run through of some of the
Mm.
5 counterfeits of courage that Aristotle gives. And remember, look, Aquinas is saying that it's contingent upon justice. So bear that in mind as we go through these. First one, Aristotle says if you got an action that's performed for the sake of honor or just to avoid disgrace, well, that doesn't meet the full requirement for courage. If you're just trying to avoid disgrace or just get honor for yourself, no. And think about the fact that um, Christ, for example, yes, he was honoring God and doing the right thing, but there was no real motive in terms of worldly honor for doing what he did. If someone just wants to make a show of speaking out against transgenderism, for example, because they think they're going to get some kind of honor for doing that, a pat on the back, what a brave person you are. No, that's not courage in the full sense.
Yeah,
Next one
no.
Aristotle gives is professional soldiers who think that because their weaponry or their armor is so great, they have zero chance of losing and they go into battle. Well, no, they've got nothing to fear, but that's not the same thing as having genuine courage. So we can apply that to situations as well. If you think there's an easy win to be had by speaking out against something and you'll look brave by doing so, but actually it's because you think there's nothing to fear, you're not courageous then either. The
We
next
could
one is, yeah,
wait. I want to throw in. We can apply that too to modern warfare. A lot of modern warfare. So much of, I mean, think about it's taken fear out of the equation for so many of,
drone,
certainly, I know, like the Western, the American military apparatus, where so much stuff is executed by drone attacks, by things like this. It's really removed the fear aspect, and I think it's actually even changed the instinct people have toward conflict and toward resolution, toward
right?
peace, for the worse, for the
Who was that
negative.
king? There
Uh,
was there was a king when the first trebuchet, the big siege catapult for taking down castles, was invented. He looked at it and he just said, "Honor is dead." Like
yeah,
he
yeah,
saw the trebuchet and said, "Honor is
yeah.
dead."
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, and so take that to the, thousandth degree, and you've got a drone where you're, sitting in like a storage container in Las Vegas, attacking someone in the Middle East or something. It's reprehensible.
right.
So much of the videos we're seeing of Israel's attack on Gaza people, where they're saying, "Well, this is a target." I don't care if that's a targeted, you know military. First off, I know that those concepts are very transient. if all of a sudden Catholics became, became more actively persecuted, actively sort of persecuted. And,
Mm,
if I'm adjacent to these, I mean, come on, it would, I'm living at home, living a quiet Catholic life. Would I be included? What they claim are these, sort of the network of terrorists in Gaza. It's like, would I be included in that? Like, come on, does that mean that there's some form of justice if you send a drone strike? Like, this is absurd.
right.
And I think that that's one of the things that's happened where that technology has really dehumanized the situation. It's not even just
Sure.
people always, well, the language starts to dehumanize. It's like, no, the technology just dehumanizes them.
Yeah,
The fact that
exactly.
we're carrying out drone strikes from a distance, from a safe distance, is intrinsically going to dehumanize this interaction.
Yeah.
And I mean, so those things, yeah, that one just came to mind. It's like, if you have superior technology, you're not even good. Well, now imagine, like I said, in modern war, where you don't even, many of these people aren't even facing it.
Mm.
I mean, come on,
Well,
this is
there's the whole shift from the knight to the soldier, which is a really interesting. Oh, hold on. There's a
it's a good bark,
yeah, it's a big dog. There's
big
there's a
bark.
there's a shift from the knight to the soldier, which is so important because at that
Mm.
point, like the vow of chastity and the higher cause beyond just the government changes, and you get the mercenary rather than someone who really has this code of conduct that governs all aspects of life. So we should look at that at some point as well.
Oh,
Number
that's
three,
actually really cool.
yeah, because you could bring the samurai into that too, right? The
Yeah,
samurai and the
yeah,
way they confronted the modernization of Japan and how they felt that their code was also threatened. The samurai and the knight is such an
yeah.
interesting parallel. And when the Jesuit missionaries went to Asia to go and preach the gospel, the samurai all loved the message of Christ about being willing to die and shed blood for the truth. That's what
Wow,
resonated most with them. It's the easiest way to convert them. Um,
wow.
the next counterfeit of courage Aristotle mentions is just anger. Like if someone is just acting out of rage and uncontrolled anger, then you don't have that right ordering of reason and priorities, which goes to make up courage. He likens this to being like an enraged animal rather than a human being. Think of like a mama bear just bowling out and coming to attack some big pickup coming through Alaska or something. It's just the rage there, the instinct. A courageous man doesn't behave like that. Next one, overconfidence. So when you get really drunk, for example, and you go into a fight thinking, "Yeah, I can take these 20 guys," you're not actually being brave there. You've just got a kind of overconfidence or wishful thinking. And that's related to number five with the misapprehension of danger. He gives the example of the Argives who attacked the Spartans not knowing who they were. So they seem really brave, thinking it was a weaker enemy. When they figure out it's the Spartans, they all run away. So you might just have misapprehended the danger involved. Once you understand it, the fear actually overwhelms you. So it's interesting to think
It's like
about those five different kinds.
It's like the people who run into, like, conservative politics and start critiquing socialism, and then they realize, oh, conservatism is more meaningfully critiquing these other things they weren't right. They're, get me out of here!
Yeah.
I don't actually want to be a critic.
Yeah.
Wait. We're talking about, Jews and race and women and hold on. What, can't conservatism just return to a more sensible? It's like, you guys didn't even know what you were getting. You guys don't even know what battle's going on right now. Like,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
thing is way deeper than that at this point. That reminds me of that.
That's a
Well,
great
I was just going to say
example.
that socialism cripples an economy. It's not a viable economic solution. Great.
So next week we should probably hit on justice, I guess, and
Yeah.
imprudence last.
Yep. And then at some point we'll start throwing in the sort of the one offers. We got to do one on meekness, on moderating anger,
Mm,
and all this stuff. So
yeah.
we'll
Why meekness isn't
continue to have some
weakness.
fodder for a while. So
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, great to speak to you. Thanks so much for your time. Looking forward to next
yeah,
week.
you too, buddy.
All right. Take care. God bless.
God bless.